Hey everyone, thanks for coming. For those who don't know me, but mostly for anyone watching in the ether of the internet, a brief introduction. My name's Rouzbeh Shadpey. I'm an artist, writer, and musician with a doctorate in medicine and indefatigable fatigue. My work and writing bear on the clinic, its anticolonial modes, its aesthetics, and poetics. And both are highly informed by this biographical tension between my professional training in medicine and my lived experience with medically unexplained illness. And it's really this tension that I'm constantly attempting to work through various media in my practice, whether it's essays, performance, sound, video. I'm going to talk this evening about my project at the Jan van Eyck called A Deferential Diagnosis of Fatigue. And since it's still early days, and since the work is still very much in progress, I've decided to take this time and treat this presentation more of a lecture that would elucidate some of the aesthetic, theoretical, political, and clinical stakes of my work. Yeah, and while this certainly won't be as engaging as like showing works, I think that it'll help to circumscribe and hopefully demystify what I mean when I talk about fatigue, because I realize it might not be that evident, or at least it certainly isn't for me. So the presentation is going to be divided into 3 sections, the first one being the theoretical underpinnings, and this will be by far the lengthiest one. And depending on how we're doing with time, then I will discuss some current work, and if there's any time left over, then some future work. Yeah, and then I've also printed transcripts, so for anybody who would like to follow, you can grab one, but they're all gone. So maybe share some amongst you. And also there's some slides for the more visually minded. And then if there are any kind of questions that have to do with jargon or more technical references, we could take them up in the question period. All right. In the enigmatic preface to French writer Maurice Blanchot's The Infinite Conversation, 2 anonymous interlocutors are gathered in a nondescript room beyond the pale of history. They are weary. This is their sole trait, and weariness conditions their conversation. Quote, when he speaks of weariness, it is difficult to know what he is speaking of, end quote. In the to and fro of dialogue, the futility of their conversation is laid bare. How can the weary subject express fatigue when fatigue not only undoes the subjectivity required for its experience, but the speech capable of its expression? This is Blanchot's conceit, the theoretical implications of which extend far beyond the post-structuralist literary analysis that usually monopolizes its intellectual debate. For the question of fatigue, what fatigue is, remains to this day gravely under-theorized across all disciplines, medical, literary, philosophical, or otherwise. Shouldering the brunt of this ignorance's burden are the all-too-real people caught in the debilitating throes of protracted weariness, whom Western medicine haphazardly diagnoses with chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis, MECFS for short. Theirs is a life condemned to an illness without a disease, an affliction which, no matter how severe, carries no ontological weight in the eyes of science or society. Indeed, chronic fatigue is, in the words of Blanchot, that most modest of misfortune, the most neutral of neutrals. And Roland Barthes, which about who I'm going to talk about later, makes this funny joke where he says in his writing, you know, if you're calling in sick or, you know, you want to skip out on work, what's an excuse you won't give to your boss? Well, you won't tell him I can't come in because I'm tired. It's ridiculous, right? Hence Blanchot calling it the most modest of misfortunes. And it's caught in this state of permanent interstitiality, you know, where the subject is simultaneously sick and not sick with a condition that is both physical and mental, but neither psychopathological nor biomedical. The weary subject has but one demand. I don't ask that weariness be done away with. I ask to be led back to a region where it might be possible to be weary. Anchored firmly within this wish, to be led to the place of weariness's possibility, I've chosen to dedicate my time at Jan van Eyck toward developing a critical clinical methodology for the artistic research and expression of fatigue, focusing on its so-called pathological or chronic form. Conceptualized as a deferential diagnosis, deferential spelled D-E-F-E-R-E-N-T-I-A-L, this novel method of research creation seeks to generate a speculative, transdisciplinary symptomatology of chronic fatigue, spanning visual art, medicine, theory, and literature. The artistic output of this research will be a compendium of fatigues, although not necessarily a textual one. Inspired by French philosopher Roland Barthes' lectures on the neutral, defined by the writer as a dictionary not of definitions but of twinklings, each entry in the compendium will address a figure of chronic fatigue, a metaphor, image, or concept that embodies chronic fatigue. And so here you have like the table of contents of Barthes' figures of the neutral. And what I really enjoy about this entity of the figure is its capaciousness. You know, Barthes has here abstract concepts such as weariness, for example, being one of them. But then there's also these more specific figures of kairos, wu-wei, the androgen. So the entity of figure really allows one to take on many different entities. And each figure in this compendium would then be explored in writing and or artistic interventions in different media. And taken together, they'll form a constellation of fragments, to which I've given the name deferential diagnosis, that will outline a transdisciplinary poetics of weariness that blurs the registers between the clinical and the critical, the organic and the psychosocial. Okay. As an artist who's been suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome for over half a decade, moreover, as one who has studied medicine and has worked as a psychiatry resident, I'm acutely aware of the failures of medical science to dignify the experience of fatigue. Whether in the clinic or beyond it, the complaint of fatigue is either met with, there's nothing wrong with you, or the projective reciprocation of, well, everyone's tired. It's to address these failures of the clinic, of language, that I seek to develop conceptual and practical modes of weary existence. This feels especially urgent since the advent of long COVID ushered the experience of debilitating fatigue into our communal realities and psyches on an unprecedented scale. My own encounter with chronic fatigue predated the pandemic and rendered me a split subject caught in the chiasm between the positivist theories of my medical training and my lived experience of disavowed suffering at the hands of a quote-unquote medically unexplained illness. It's this epistemological and ontological abyss from which my artistic thinking and practice are born and whose void they seek to address. At the heart of this project is therefore the vexed relationship between the epistemic and aesthetic registers commonly dichotomized as the critical and the clinical. The fatigue I take to be the object of my study demarcates and inhabits the threshold between these realms, never fully congealing in either. It's simultaneously a clinical entity, that is to say, a biomedical concept with biopolitical implications, and a critical one, a concept formed and informed by literature, philosophy, and art. One encounters this conceptual promiscuity most readily, perhaps, in the figure of the neurasthenic, that medical subject of weariness par excellence, whose disease has traditionally been framed in terms of its poetic profusion of symptoms in both writing and speech. This is all the more befitting given that the physician who pioneered the diagnosis of neurasthenia in Europe was none other than a certain Dr. Adrien Proust, the father of that particularly weary writer, Marcel, who some conjecture to be its patient zero. So here you see the kind of seminal work on neurasthenia by Dr. Proust, who was de facto the father of Marcel Proust, which really kind of, lends primacy to this porousness between the clinical and the critical as separate realms. And then, this kind of symbiosis between these realms follows in the work of the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, insofar that I contend that a rigorous study of fatigue requires that we examine, quote, how the critical in the literary sense and the clinical in the medical sense may be destined to enter into a new relationship of mutual learning. And here what Deleuze is really expressing is this conviction that artistic praxis can not only critique, but create clinical knowledge. And this conviction firmly undergirds not only this project, but all my work. To put it otherwise, to put it simply, I'm not trying to write about the clinic, but I'm trying to write the clinic itself. So this is kind of the distinction, I think, that I'm trying to, that I really gather from Deleuze's unfulfilled promise, if you want, of a critical clinic. And I'd say that this ethos is one I perceive to somewhat be lacking in today's contemporary artistic discourse, practice, and curation on the themes of health and illness, where the propensity is to reproduce modern medicine's aesthetics and poetics instead of redefining them. Now, I haven't included any specific references because that would be very shady, but you can already imagine kind of the number of shows about health and illness that recycle these empty signifiers of health and medicine and the hospital. So, the kind of technocratic hospital, pills, molecules, white coats, hospital gowns, beds, like this array of aesthetics and signifiers kind of populate the way we think about the relationship between the clinic and the artistic. And so I'm really kind of trying to go beyond this. And if you're interested, I've written about this. I've kind of fleshed this critique out in a review essay for Momus called A Clinic the Size of the World, where essentially I argue that the aesthetic reproduction of modern technocratic medicine within artistic space precipitates the reification of health and illness along the lines of Western colonial medicine. And then the question becomes, well, how do you forego this mimetic impulse and really kind of pursue this Deleuzian wager to redefine what counts as the clinic in the first place? And that involves setting forth novel symptomatologies of weariness and weary existence, and rewriting these kind of crude syndromes like chronic fatigue syndrome that we believe to be the realm of clinical knowledge. And Deleuze himself practices this methodology in his work on sadomasochism, where he kind of explains that the psychiatrist Krafft Ebing, who invented the diagnosis of sadomasochism, got it wrong because he didn't pay enough attention to the creative wellspring of this syndrome, which was the writing of Leopold von Sacher-Masoch. So then Deleuze preaches a return to the writing itself, as opposed to kind of the diagnosis of the author, if you will. What am I doing? Okay. Okay, so I think at this point it's helpful to venture a more thorough definition of what I mean by chronic or so-called pathological fatigue. As I've already suggested, the challenge to definition or diagnosis is itself constitutive of the concept of fatigue. Fatigue is what you'd call an apophatic signifier in the sense that it's defined by what it's not. And in this case, fatigue is defined, the modern scientific concept of fatigue is defined by the lack of energy, by the absence of energy, which is itself an abstract unit of thermodynamics, which would essentially come to stand in for the white worker's labor power. So you get this like double level of abstraction where fatigue is defined by not being energy, but then what is energy? We don't really know, except that that's also an abstraction of labor power, and moreover, not anyone's labor power, but the labor power of workers at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, which is to say white workers. Because fatigue is a scientific concept that was born at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And so then the concept of fatigue was kind of born into existence to demarcate the collapse of the white workers' laboring body, essentially, both as prophylaxis and prescription. So, you know, how do we avoid that limit? Because we need these workers to keep working, but also once that limit is drawn, how can we treat it and cure it? And at the beginning of the 20th century, there was all these social utopian convictions and plans about eliminating fatigue. So you had a very social, energetic, utopian drive in mainland Europe that was born with kind of the dawn of the Industrial Revolution that obviously didn't work because, well, everyone's fucking tired. So then the question becomes, how do you think about a fatigue that has no relationship to energetic expenditure on one hand, and the rehabilitative cycles of rest and repose on the other? This is what chronic fatigue is, or pathological fatigue. It's fatigue that is constant, that it's an emptying that never ceases to empty. So it defies physics in a way. This fatigue keeps on growing, even though you think that you've reached its end, you have not. It will keep on growing indefinitely. And so, you know, this is like a question that I've explored in an essay called At the Mercy of Limitless Loss, Physiological and Economies of Chronic Fatigue. And it's really kind of that question that I asked, that what is left of the concept of fatigue when it's been severed of energy on one hand and rest on the other, you know? And so I went looking for that, but I didn't find any kind of hints in science or medicine. Where I did find kind of hints as to what that may look like is in philosophy. And especially in the writing of Emmanuel Levinas, who's one of the few philosophers to have actually philosophized the question of fatigue. This is a little image. So Levinas writes, "What wearies then is not a particular form of our life. The weariness concerns existence itself. In weariness, existence is something like the reminder of a commitment to exist, the impossible refusal of this ultimate obligation. In weariness, we want to escape existence itself and not only one of its landscapes." So essentially, Levinas gives fatigue the status of an ontology, which is to say that he makes it a characteristic of being itself, not of any mode of being, but of being itself. So we're born into the world tired, and we leave it tired, and you know, it's quite depressing, really, but liberating also. And if you think of it that way, we know one of the things that Levinas says is that then resisting it is futile. To resist this fatigue of living is futile. And the concept of futility really I found quite helpful. Because if you think about the etymological ties of futility, you have, well, futility derives from the Latin futilis, which means to leak. The futile, leaky vessel is there more apt a metaphor for chronic fatigue. You know, from the myth of the Danaids, who you see here, who are condemned to fill up their perforated barrel with water for the rest of eternity, to the perpetually recurring literary figure of the eternally deflating tire, to the signifier itself, fatigue, which is riddled with holes and leaking meaning. This kenosis is as close to a definition of chronic fatigue as I can identify. Okay. So, just checking how we're doing for time. I want to briefly specify that, if you probably noticed, all my references have been white, and moreover, they've been male. And this is not a bias of selection. The concept of fatigue is steeped in the historical materiality of whiteness. And the traces are everywhere, whether it's in the legacy of neurasthenia as a pathological foil for American racecraft, the underdiagnosis of MECFS in racialized populations, the blaring absence of Black subjects from the archive of so-called contested illness memoirs. This list is very long, and well, it's not the sole focus of this project to rewrite this archive beyond its whiteness. It definitely is something that is in the back of my mind. And so then what I also kind of briefly want to touch upon is that one of the aims of bringing the work here was to kind of explore these questions in terms of space and installation. Because clearly, as you can probably tell, there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of language. The poetics are very important, but then language runs dry at some point. And this is especially true in the case of fatigue, really. Sorry, I'm just going to skip over these. But I just want to briefly mention that for this, I take inspiration in the work of Hannah Black, who some of you might know. She just had a show at Vlieshow that closed. But Hannah Black is both a writer and an artist. And in a lecture entitled Writing and Making, Writing as Making, delivered during a symposium on the theme sculpture and literature, Black details the relationship between both of these media in her practice, and she says, quote, "I turn to art when I feel overwhelmed by the prospect of making an argument, and what I want to do is make a constellation, in the hope that something will arise through that constellation," end quote. And this really speaks to me, I think, because I also feel overwhelmed by the argumentative at times, and especially when it comes to this kind of fragmentary, interrupted, scattered nature of fatigue itself. And so this mode of constellation building, constellation spatializing, really resonates with me and is something that I'm hoping to work on here. Yeah. I think, okay. All right, I think that's good for the theoretical. So far the deferential diagnosis of fatigue has taken a few forms, mostly textual. So one of them is an experimental syllabus I wrote for a platform called the Syllabus Project, which is a really great platform, editorial platform that that gathers syllabi by writers and artists. And you know, they really kind of expand the definition of what a syllabus is. And so I wrote the deferential diagnosis as a syllabus, and in the syllabus I have these 6 points as being possible deferential diagnoses of fatigue, and then I elaborate them and I also give readings for them. So that's online if anybody wants to look at that. And as you'll see, they kind of touch upon some of the themes that I've addressed so far. Then in March, I delivered the deferential diagnosis as a performative lecture at Duke University in the States in the Department of Cultural Anthropology. And there, the question really was to become, the question really was, what, how does one lecture about fatigue? To put it very bluntly, in the sense that it didn't suffice to just speak about this experience of interruption, fragmentation, and contingency, but really these questions had to be incorporated into the form of the lecture itself, which, as you know, is very teleological and narrative. And so the way I kind of conceptualized it, I could show you, actually. Ooh, I will show you. That's what I'll do. I made an arena page where I gathered the different diagnoses under a keyword, essentially the title of the diagnosis. And the dice, the symbol of the dice that you see before each diagnosis is a reference to Stéphane Mallarmé, whose Un coup de dé jamais n'abolira le hasard became kind of a cornerstone, like it has to many people, to think about the relationship between form and contingency and writing. And so you have these titles here, and the only hint that's given is the length, the approximate length. So one dice signifies a short intervention, and two dice signifies a longer intervention. And the interventions spanned from short essays, poem readings, character studies, found footage, original footage, sound. So you had the whole gamut, from the performative to the audio to the visual to the textual. And I set a time. 40 minutes was the allotted time I had. And I introduced this kind of premise. And then I told the audience, the clinic has made me an unreliable narrator. And so you will decide what will be said today. And then I asked the first person to choose a diagnosis. And once that was done, it went on and so forth. And when time was up, even if it cut me mid-sentence, I stopped. So there was a drastic cut, almost the kind of cut you would find in Lacanian psychoanalysis, where the analyst decides the session's over, when it is. So it was this way of thinking about lecturing while making myself vulnerable to contingency and fragmentation, and also treating it really as an embodied form. And yeah, maybe I'll just end with a little video of that was part of the differential diagnosis. I guess we'll end there. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone to join the presentation today. I'm Chia-Wei, and today I'm going to talk about a series of works I've made in collaboration with archaeology. I've gotten a lot of inspiration from archaeology, and that's really shaped the direction of my projects in recent years. So to kick things off, I'd like to show you a short video first. The video you just watched is part of my 3-channel video work called A Performance in the Church. And we filmed this piece in Hoping Island in northern Taiwan. Even though the clip is pretty short, but it actually condenses 3 years worth of work and experiences. Since 2018, I've been working closely with archaeologists. I follow them during their excavation processes. At the very start of the video, you can see the beginning of the archaeological excavation, where they are just starting to cut into the floor. So just imagine, no one really know what they were going to find back then. And after 3 years of excavation, they finally uncover a complete foundation of a 17th century church. At the same time, they also found a cemetery right next to the church. You can see that most of the graves have bodies laid out in a fixed direction, with the hands clasping like a missionary's burial pose. But there were two that stood out. Their body were bent, and their hands and feet were tied behind their backs. This was actually a traditional burial style of the local indigenous people. Back in the day, they would tie up the deceased, carry them on their backs, and travel far to bury them. The fact that both missionaries and indigenous people were buried in the same cemetery shows how closely they lived together at that time. Working with archaeologists has inspired me a lot, and it's got me thinking about how archaeology could actually be a great reference for my practice. I also feel like archaeology helped me overcome some of the challenges I've faced in my artistic practice process. In recent years, the idea of the anthropocentric thinking has become like a mainstream in lots of field things, like speculative realism, or object-oriented ontology, or like animism. And sometimes it's about looking at different times and spaces through non-human perspectives. But when it comes to making art, the question is, we are human after all. So how do we deal with times and places we've never actually experienced? That's something I've struggled with in my own work. A lot of my past projects involve working with people in different locations. But when I'm dealing with things from ancient times or non-human elements, how do I change the way I approach them? Especially, how can I work with these different times and spaces in a way that's tangible, like treating them as actual materials, instead of just imagining them in theory. I feel like archaeology is a perfect reference for this. The way archaeologists work give us an entry point into real physical facts, connecting poetic imagination and rational science. It provides a solid material foundation to connect with distant times and places, and opens up new possibilities of further artistic practice. I think there are a few things about archaeology that fit really well with artistic practice, especially when you mix different fields together. Firstly, archaeology is about how people can use contemporary technology to investigate the details of objects, to imagine a time and space that we never experienced. And secondly, archaeology is about focusing on the material to develop time and space context. This part of archaeology can engage in a dialogue with the new materialism of recent years. Thirdly, archaeology gives us a different perspective than traditional history. Historians usually rely on written records, which are often made by people in power and focus on big events. Archaeology, on the other hand, look at everyday life. Like you won't find a story about homeless people in history books, but archaeology often deal with these hidden parts of the past. If archaeologists discover an ancient treasure site, it can be a treasure trove filled with clues to study. And fourth, integrating the technologies. Today, archaeology working method result in a paradigm shift, leading to interdisciplinary work that might include geology, botany, physics, and more. This allows to detail analysis of small materials from various fields. And finally, archaeology opens up narratives that go beyond human time scales. As our technology moves forward, we can look backward farther. Archaeology is the technique to imagine unknown things. So all these qualities of archaeology are what inspire the artistic approach I've developed over the past few years working with archaeologists. And the site we just talked about was in northern Taiwan. And from that place and those archaeological clues, I've been able to develop a whole series of works. This Spanish church area was taken over by the Dutch in 1642. The Dutch kicked out the Spanish from Taiwan and built Fort New Holland right next to this church. And around the same time, in 1643, there was a war between the Dutch and Cambodia. All these events happening so close together in Asia waters really caught my attention and led me to make another piece called Samurai and Deer in Cambodia. The Cambodia-Dutch War actually started because of the deer skin trade. When the Dutch East India Company, as VOC, took over Taiwan, they exported a ton of deer skin to Japan. Back then, deer were considered sacred in Japan, and people like to use deer antlers and deer skin to decorate samurai armor. So there was a huge demand for deer skin. But pretty soon there are like fewer and fewer deer in Taiwan. So VOC tried to take over the deer skin market in Cambodia, which ended up causing the war. So for this project, I filmed part of it in a samurai workshop in Japan, another part in a deer sanctuary in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And I also filmed footage at the actual site of the war along the Mekong River near Phnom Penh. I would like to show you a short clip from this video work.
ជនបរទេសបាននាំគ្នាមកទីនេះគឺដើម្បីទិញស្បែកសត្វឆ្លុះនេះយកទៅលក់នៅប្រទេសជប៉ុនកាលនោះនៅប្រទេសជប៉ុនគឺជាសម័យកាលអ៊ីឌុកាលពេលនោះដែលសាមរ៉ៃត្រូវបានទទួលស្គាល់និងចាត់ទុកថាជាឋានៈដ៏ខ្ពង់ខ្ពស់ក្នុងប្រទេសជប៉ុន
特にこの鹿の角を兜の横につけるということは戦国の中で多くの武将がですね、再現しているわけですね。これはやはり当時いかにその鹿というものがですね神に近い神聖な存在で強いものの象徴であったかということをですね端的に表していると思います。
បន្ទាប់ពីក្រុមហ៊ុនហូឡង់ឥណ្ឌាខាងកើតបានបញ្ជូនសំពៅទៅកម្ពុជាដើម្បីប្រកាសសង្គ្រាមមេបញ្ជាការត្រូវបានសម្លាប់ដោយការនងគ្រាប់បាញ់ពីច្រាំងទន្លេចម្បាំងដ៏កំណាចនេះធ្វើឲ្យប្រកាសចិត្តថាតិចជាងពាក់កណ្ដាលនៃពលទាហានហូឡង់និងពលជើងទឹកគ្មានកម្លាំងគ្រប់គ្រាន់នឹងធ្វើសកម្មភាពតបតបាន
This work we talk is about the war between Cambodia and the Dutch that happened in 1643. While I was working with archaeologists over the past few years, I also found out that in Malacca, there's another fort, and the governors mentioned that VOC built in 1641. That's the red building you see on the screen right now. I also made another work in Malacca called Stones and Elephants. As you can see, the governance mentioned in Malacca was built in 1641. Then the Dutch built Fort North Holland in northern Taiwan in 1642. And the war in Cambodia broke out in 1643. These events all happened one after another, year by year. This work tells the story of William Farquhar, who was sent to Malacca as a governor by the British East India Company in the early 19th century. Malacca used to belong to the VOC, but while the Netherlands was busy fighting the Napoleonic War in Europe, they handed Malacca over to the British. So at the start of the 19th century, William Farquhar became the governor of Malacca. And I found a diary written by Farquhar's secretary, which was published in 1849. I picked out two stories from the diary for this work. And the first one is about elephants. Farquhar was really into zoology. His governance mansion was basically the first zoo in the Malay Peninsula. He kept all kinds of animals there and even hired artists to make scientific drawing in the jungle. At one point, he hired a Malay shaman to help him catch elephants in the forest. The shaman managed to catch 62 elephants, but in the end, only one survived and made its way back to the governor's mansion. Most of the elephant remains were sent to the British East India Company's museum to display. And the second story is about knocking down the fort. When the British East India Company was about to hand Malacca back to the Dutch, William Farquhar ordered to destroy Malacca's fort because they want to leave the Netherlands with a weakly defensive fort. At first, Farquhar asked a bunch of workers to try to knock it down, but the walls were so strong and stable that it took several months. There were even rumors that the fort was cursed. People say there was a devil inside, and that's why so many workers got sick or died. And eventually, Farquhar decided to use gunpowder and blew up the fort right away. For the locals, it was the first time they'd ever seen gunpowder, and it was a real direct show of modern power in the colony. This explosion didn't just destroy the wall, it also destroyed the local belief and their cosmology. In this work, I invite a Malay shaman who came from the same village, like the one who helped William Farquhar catch the elephant in the story. And in this work, the shaman is reading this diary and praying for the filming crew of this work. And what you are seeing now is how this piece looked when it's on display. The large printouts are mounted on the wall, and there are screens set up on site. When this work is shown, it needs to be connected to the internet. In the background of the video, you can see a Google search page. That search is happening in real time, so it changes every day depending on what's happening in the world. I work with an engineer to build a program that will search in real time based on our preset keywords, such as the world news with the highest number of views every day, or elephants news, and so on. This live search screen gets combined with the video footage I film. So you will notice that certain keywords end up linking the past and the present. It seems like a human just keep repeating the same strange things over and over. And now let me show you a short clip from Stone and Elephant.
Ada satu ketika aku tidak membuat apa-apa. Aku hanya boleh membaca dan menulis. Tiba-tiba ada suatu berita tersebar di Melaka. Ya Allah, ya Allah, ya Allah, ya Allah, ya Rahman. Ya Allah, ya Allah, ya Rahman. Dan kau pemudahkanlah drone kami ini, ya Allah. Tenaga pembantu bergila-gila untuk bekerja. Berita ini tergempar hingga Melaka. Semua orang tidak sabar untuk melihat bagaimana pagar yang digunakan untuk menangkap gajah itu dipasang. Hanya tinggal lebih kurang 6-7 ekor saja yang tiba di Melaka, tetapi hanya 1 ekor saja yang hidup. Sekarang aku ingin kembali kepada cerita tentang rancangan Tuan Raja Farquhar untuk meroboh tembok kota Melaka. Pada suatu hari, tersebarlah berita yang berkata Gubernur perintah untuk menggali lubang besar di bawah benteng di tepi laut dan letakkan banyak serbuk bahan api di dalam lubang. Pada keesokan harinya, Raja Farquhar muncul di atas kuda dan memegang tali api di tangannya. Selepas kira-kira 10 minit, kemudian serbuk mesyul meletup dengan bunyi seperti guruh. Serpihan tembok kota adalah sebesar gajah.
And what I just talked about are the video works I developed while working with archaeologists, kind of like a web of connections, where one archaeological clue lead to another. And before the excavation at Hoping Island in northern Taiwan wrapped up, I worked with a composer to put on a performance right at the excavation site. We use the artifacts that they found as inspiration to create special instruments, and we also use some digital acoustic technique to recreate what the sound environment might have been like there in the 17th century. We mix in religious music and the church, from the church, and traditional music from the local indigenous tribe. So layer by layer, the sound come together like the voice of Asian people, modern folks, colonizer, and animals, all blending in this soundscape. And I also made a feature-length documentary during this process. The film showed the journey I went through during that time, along with some thoughts about archaeology. And I have one mini trailer for you to watch.
这是一条循着这些考古的线索所发展出来的路径。这些遗留下来的残骸，跟着泥土、石块一起被埋到了地表底下，然后才化成这个考古场景里面一片一片的物质碎片。这些考古学家的工作虽然很科学，但其实也很诗意。他们用当代的技术，然后非常专注于这些很细微的物质碎片。他们就是用这么有限的线索，一个物质跟一个物质，去想象一个超越我们经验的一个很巨大的时空。
Okay, and finally, I like to share a project I'm still working on that's continue my collaboration with archaeologists, focusing on underwater archaeology. And we are making an work around warship that's sunken in the late 19th century and during World War II. This old man lived on an island next to the shipwreck. and he make instrument out of materials he find. He is singing a song about life on a ship. And we've researched the kind of music that might have been played on those ship back then. And we are using sonar technology to send sound back down to the shipwreck on the sea floor and then capture the echoes. And some sound engineers are recording underwater while performers play spatial instruments we made down in the sea. By this way, the boat on the water above the shipwreck become a kind of live sound performance, like having a conversation with the shipwreck below. And this project is set to be finished in July, and I hope to share more about it with you then. And that's all I want to share this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chia-Wei. Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between archaeology and music in your work, or sound? we've seen it, but I wanted to just hear more thoughts about it within how you're thinking about your work.
Those work that I show is from like 2017 till 2022, and you can see my early work from my presentation. You always see someone reading or talking in the work. And recently, I'm thinking, try to avoid about the language in my work, especially when I work with archaeologists. I realized that there are too many about like for example, when I talk about historian, they study about those documents. It's all the written documents, and it's too dangerous. It's easy to jump into the mainstream. So later on, I start to try to avoid the language. And I think the music or sound is the way that I think I can create some like that you feel like a real touch the material, not through the language. Yeah. So that's why I start to work with musician and composer. And in my work, I usually like to do this way. I put them together. I invite the archaeologist and composer and do kind of like a workshop and put them together to discuss. And they can also know each other. Yeah, so this is how I work for my project. And I also got one quite interesting concept called archaeacoustic. Archaeacoustic is kind of like it's about the acoustic, but it's not. They are two concepts. One is music history, right? When those musicians they study about history, they know what kind of instrument in the old day they use, or about like the music style or something like that. But archaeacoustic is about that how archaeology use sound as tool to do research about the excavation site. For example, a sonar in the underwater archaeology is exactly sample for archaeacoustic. And also for church, for example, in the old day, the Spanish, when they occupied northern Taiwan, they will push those local people to live nearby the church, the area that you can hear the bell. You have to live in that area. You cannot stay out of the. So you see, if we use the sense of sound for archaeology, actually we can find more than just a visual or document. Yeah. So this is also the interesting part that I collaborate with composer and we are working on about this archaeacoustic.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. I want to ask you about humor, because I feel that in your works there's a lot of humor. I don't know which is your perspective.
Yeah. Yes. Today my presentation, I talk about archaeology, right? And actually, I can talk totally different topic from my practice. For example, I can use animal as a topic to talk my previous work. You can see the project relate to elephant, relate to deer. I also make the other project about Malayan tapir and also giant panda. I think it's interesting to use different points to see the history, not just from the human, and also now many like a young generation of historian, they also start to create a new framework They did a research about the animal in the history. They kind of to have a different viewpoint to see the history. And and I'm not sure it's I like to put something that you think is totally not related, but I like to put them together. Like there's one project I did in Singapore Zoo. I have an actor. She acts as a how to say tour guide in the zoo, and then telling story about animal. But it's nothing about animal. It's all related to colonial history. And so I think that I like to put something like a totally different. But when I put them together, it can create some new meaning from this, like kind of, I don't know how to call, encounter, something like this. Yeah. So this may be also that project feel more light or a bit fun.
Thanks for the presentation. I would like to hear a bit more about your position as an artist in this whole process, like more precisely, because you said you collaborate a lot with other professions and you invite them together and you see what comes out and what is your exact role in this process. Are you more like a director and says, this is okay, I like this result, or maybe we should push a bit more like that, or or for example, also for this archaeological excavation, do you go there and live with them, or no? I just want to hear more. Thanks.
I think the most difficult part for my practice is not about filming or like to install the work. The most difficult part is about how to get those people trust me and allow me to film. Most of my projects I film in some very strange or like a spatial place. Those image is not easy to see from like our everyday life. I work with like a old soldier in the northern Thailand in a border or some small island or many strange place. And I think the most difficult part is about how to convince them. And usually I would tell them I'm the artist. I want to collaborate with you. And most of them doesn't know what is artist. They think they may think, oh, I'm the easy way that they think I'm the documentary film director. That's easy part that they can understand, or they think I'm journalist. And then the step by step, I show my work or I start to build a relationship with them. And they start to understand a bit about I do something strange, not just a documentary film. So, yeah, and also in my work when I film in a place, I don't have like a very clear script. I like to do improvise. My job is to set a stage and give them some mission. I invite a musician, performer, archaeologist, different people to get on this stage. And they do what they usually do, and they start to work together, and it's improvise. And then I start to film about this stage. So this is how I work in my work. Yeah.
Just making sure I'm not missing anyone. Just shout if you have a question. Maybe just to put something else on the table, I think it's good to just throw it around because other people might be interested and might not have that conversation with you. But can you talk a little bit about this, your latest work and this relation between digital technology and archaeology, and that ties into maybe a little bit of the AI project that you're developing now?
Actually, my new project in Yang Bang Ike is related to AI. Because I also collaborate with iFilm Museum, I'm going to use the archive. They have a 1,500 documentary film they shot during Dutch East India. And I'm going to use this archive as data to train AI. So in the end, I want to get one expert AI who knows Dutch East India very well. Then we can start to work with this AI. Yeah, so this is the project that I'm working on now. But I think I can share about in my practice, I'm quite interested about technology. You can also see from my previous work, I also like to show the structure of this technology. Because as a filmmaker, the camera is kind of technology, right? You can it's like a recall the memory, but at the same time, it's about you use the technology to. It's also show that how you imagine war. It's not just about the memory. It's also about the cosmology. So in the old day, like a shaman, they do the ritual. This is kind of the technology that how they talk to supernatural things, right? And the scientists, they use other technology to imagine something that beyond human. So I also interested about this cosmology behind the technology. Yeah. So when I'm working on AI, actually AI have to learn from database. But before that, AI have to classify database. AI have to make label for all the material. But how do you classify the database? It's related to cosmology. If you ask the local Indonesia people to classify those archives from film museum, or you ask a filmmaker or the historian, they will all create totally different category of the data. So in my project, I also interested about this. I want to use AI and train AI, but the whole process become my work. At the same time, I can show different ideology behind this working process. And I want to show the conflict between different fields. Yeah, this is what I'm working on now. Yeah.
Thank you. Shall we wrap it up? Yeah? Was this enjoyable? Good. Next week there's more, and it will be Xiao and Mattia. It's going to be a different setting. Be prepared. Bye.
Thank you.